The church bells tolled that morning, their sound floating through the prairie like a reminder that this was supposed to be a day of promise. Dust hung in the air from the wagons that had pulled up outside, carrying neighbors, townsfolk, even strangers eager to witness the spectacle of a wedding in a place where such occasions were rare. Inside the wooden church, the air was stifling. The fans in the hands of the women fluttered desperately, but the heat seemed to come from something heavier than summer, something born from whispers, glances, and the sense that something was not quite right. Clara stood at the front, dressed in white, though the dress was hardly the grand creation most brides might dream of. It had been stitched together with care from lace scraps her late mother had saved, sewn in long evenings by candlelight, each thread carrying hope. Her veil trembled with the faintest breeze from an open window, though she knew the shaking came more from her own hands. In her arms lay her daughter, Mary, wrapped tightly in a blanket, her small face just peeking out. The baby whimpered softly, almost as if sensing the storm that was brewing around them. Clara's heart beat wildly as her eyes flickered to the door. He should have been there by now. The man who had promised her a future, who had sworn to give her child a name and her a home. She had believed him, needed to believe him, because the alternative was too heavy to bear. Her father had died years before, her mother followed soon after, and with Mary's birth, Clara had thought herself cursed by loneliness. But when the man she thought she loved told her he would stand by her, she clung to the promise like a drowning soul clings to driftwood. The preacher cleared his throat, glancing toward the back of the church where the doors remained stubbornly shut. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Clara's cheeks flushed hot. She tightened her hold on Mary, swaying gently as if to comfort them both. She could hear the whispers, low but sharp, cutting through her like small blades. She always was too eager. Poor child, born without a father's name. A woman ought to know better than to trust a man like him. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She tried to stand tall, but her knees felt weak, her shoulders heavy under the weight of judgment. She remembered how she had dreamed of this day when she was younger, how she had imagined standing in lace, her father beaming, her mother's tears glistening with pride. Instead, she stood alone, her mother's dress clinging like a ghost, her child the only witness to her breaking heart. Minutes crawled by. Each tick of the clock on the back wall was a cruel reminder that he wasn't coming. He had abandoned her, abandoned Mary, abandoned the promise of redemption she had dared to believe in. The preacher shifted uncomfortably, his eyes soft with pity but helpless. The whispers grew bolder now, no longer hushed, because everyone could see the truth. Clara was left at the altar. Her vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them away fiercely. She would not fall apart, not here, not in front of all these people. She pulled Mary closer, whispering softly into the baby's ear, "I'll stand for you. Even if no one else does." The baby's tiny hand curled against her chest, and Clara felt both stronger and more broken all at once. The heavy creak of the church doors startled everyone. Heads turned sharply. Hope flared in Clara's chest, only to falter when she saw that it was not her groom. Instead, a tall figure stepped into the light, boots striking the floor with deliberate weight. His broad frame filled the doorway, a shadow cast across the aisle as every eye locked on him. Jacob Hayes. Even before his name was whispered across the pews, everyone knew him, the rancher who lived on the edge of town, who spoke little and appeared even less. A man carved by hardship, whose silence was as much a part of him as the calluses on his hands. People said he'd lost too much in his life, his family to sickness, his brothers to war, and that grief had carved him into stone. He kept to himself, tended his ranch, and rarely crossed into town except when necessity demanded it. No one could have expected him here, of all places. He walked forward, each step measured, his hat low but not enough to hide the hard set of his jaw. Clara froze, clutching Mary tighter. She had barely spoken more than a few words to him in the years she had known of his existence. Why was he here? Why now? When he reached the front, he stopped. His eyes lifted, meeting hers. For a moment, the world fell silent. She saw no judgment there, no pity. Only a kind of steadiness she had never known, a weight that seemed to carry her trembling frame. His gaze dropped briefly to the baby in her arms, then to the empty space beside her where her groom should have stood. His jaw tightened, and something flickered in his eyes, something she could not name. The church waited, breathless. Then he spoke, his voice deep, steady, unhurried. "She won't stand alone." The words struck like thunder. A gasp rippled through the room. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. She stared at him, unable to comprehend. Did he mean what she thought he did? Jacob turned slightly toward the preacher, his expression unchanging. If she'll have me, he said, his voice even but carrying through every corner of the church, I'll take her. Both of them. Chaos erupted in whispers. The shock was palpable, the disbelief sharp in the air. A few shook their heads, others leaned forward, eager to see the scandal unfold. Clara felt the room spinning. Her heart pounded so fiercely she thought it might burst. Jacob's eyes returned to hers, and in them she saw no hesitation. He was not a man who spoke lightly, not a man who offered words without the weight to carry them. He meant it. He was offering her not just escape from humiliation, but a place beside him. A life, a chance she had not dared to hope for. Her hands trembled around Mary. Fear coursed through her veins, but so did something else, an unfamiliar warmth, a thread of hope stitched carefully into the wreckage of her broken dream. Could she accept? Could she step into a marriage with a man she barely knew, whose silence spoke louder than words, whose scars ran deeper than she could imagine? The baby whimpered, her tiny cry cutting through the air like a plea. Clara looked down at her daughter's face, then back into Jacob's eyes. She saw strength there, not soft or romantic, but solid. A man who did not flinch, who would not abandon her as others had. Her lips parted, trembling with the weight of a decision that would shape all their lives. She whispered so faintly she wasn't sure the crowd heard her, but Jacob did. Yes. The preacher's voice quavered as he opened his book again, stumbling to find the words he hadn't expected to say that morning. Clara's world blurred, but she felt the firm brush of Jacob's hand against hers. His grip was not tender, but grounding, solid as the earth beneath her feet. And in that moment, though she stood in the ruins of one promise, she realized another had begun. One she did not yet understand, but one that just might hold. The vows were spoken quickly, awkwardly, the preacher stumbling through them with more haste than reverence. No one had come prepared for this kind of union. Clara's hands trembled as she repeated the words, her voice so faint that only the preacher and Jacob standing beside her could truly hear. Mary slept soundly in her arms, as if untouched by the storm of judgment circling the church. When the final words were spoken and the blessing given, the silence that followed was thick, heavy, and strange. There was no applause, no laughter, no shower of flowers or grain. Only whispers, disbelieving murmurs, and the shifting of feet as people prepared to rush out and carry the story to every corner of the town. Jacob did not seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He turned to Clara with the faintest inclination of his head, as if to say the moment was done, the choice had been made, and now life would move forward. He offered his arm, and Clara hesitated before taking it, her fingers barely grazing the rough fabric of his sleeve. Together they walked down the aisle, the crowd parting in uneasy silence, the weight of their stares pressing against her back. But Jacob's stride was steady, unyielding, and somehow his presence kept her upright. Outside, the prairie sun was blinding. Clara squinted against it, breathing deeply of the open air. Behind them, the church doors closed, muffling the last of the whispers. Jacob helped her into his wagon, lifting the baby with surprising gentleness before handing her back once Clara was seated. He climbed onto the bench beside her, took the reins, and with a flick of his wrist, the horses pulled them away from the church, from the town, from the ruin of what her life had been that morning. The journey to his ranch was long, the road winding through stretches of golden grass and rolling hills. Clara sat stiffly, her baby pressed against her chest, her mind a swirl of fear and disbelief. She glanced at Jacob from the corner of her eye. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. His silence unnerved her, though she suspected words were not something he gave easily. She wanted to speak, to ask why he had done it, why he had stepped forward when no one else would. But the words stuck in her throat. When the ranch finally came into view, she let out a small breath. The farmhouse stood alone against the vastness of the prairie, weathered but sturdy, its white paint faded by wind and time. Fences stretched in long lines, enclosing fields where cattle grazed. The land seemed endless, quiet, untouched by the noise of gossip and judgment. Jacob pulled the horses to a stop and climbed down, offering his hand to help her from the wagon. His touch was brief, impersonal, but steady. Inside the house, the rooms smelled faintly of wood and dust. It was sparse, plain furniture, bare walls, the kind of place built more for survival than comfort. Still, there was a warmth in its simplicity, and Clara felt a strange sense of safety, though she knew it was not yet home. Jacob carried in her few belongings from the wagon without being asked, setting them carefully by the stairs. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he lit the stove and fetched water, his movements efficient and wordless. Clara laid Mary in a small cradle Jacob had placed by the hearth, its wood polished though clearly old, perhaps belonging once to someone else. The baby slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling, oblivious to the weight of choices made in her name. Clara stood watching her daughter for a long moment, wondering what kind of life lay ahead, what kind of man this silent rancher truly was. Days fell into rhythm quickly. Jacob rose before dawn each morning, his boots striking the floor with quiet purpose. Clara would hear the creak of the door as he went out to tend to the cattle, the sound of horses in the distance, the thud of tools against wood as he repaired fences or mended the barn roof. He never asked for help, never spoke of what he was doing, but every evening he returned, weary yet steadfast. He would set down buckets of milk by the door, or a bundle of wood for the stove, and then sit quietly at the table while Clara prepared supper. They spoke little. She tried, sometimes, small questions about the ranch, about his day, but his answers were short, his voice deep and low, words clipped to necessity. At first, she mistook it for coldness, for indifference, but as the days passed, she began to see something else. He listened, even if he did not respond. He noticed things, the way she favored her right arm when carrying the baby, the way Mary fussed less when rocked near the window. He adjusted without comment, leaving tasks undone so she wouldn't strain herself, or repairing the window latch so Mary's cradle wouldn't be chilled by the night air. Clara found herself watching him in return. She noticed the gentleness that contradicted his rough exterior, the way he stroked the horse's muzzle with a quiet word, the way he lingered by the fence at dusk, staring at the horizon as though speaking to someone unseen. There was a loneliness in him, heavy and unspoken, that mirrored her own. Still, doubts gnawed at her heart. Had he married her out of pity, out of some sense of duty? Would he one day grow weary of the burden she and Mary surely were? At night, when the baby cried and Clara sat rocking her in exhaustion, she would feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down, threatening to crush her resolve. One evening, the wind rose outside, rattling the shutters and howling across the fields. Mary cried inconsolably, her small body writhing in Clara's arms. Exhausted, Clara sank to the floor by the hearth, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "I can't do this, not alone, not again." Her voice cracked, filled with the pain she had tried so hard to bury. The floorboards creaked behind her. She looked up, startled, to see Jacob standing there, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. For a moment, she braced herself for silence, for him to turn away. Instead, he knelt beside her, his presence filling the room with a quiet strength. He reached out, hesitant at first, and she placed Mary in his arms. The sight of that rugged man holding her fragile daughter was almost too much for Clara to bear. His large hands dwarfed the tiny bundle, yet they were steady, careful. He rocked her awkwardly at first, but then Mary's cries softened, her small body relaxing against his chest. The silence that followed was profound. Jacob looked down at the baby, then at Clara, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "You're not alone," he said quietly. Just 4 words, simple and unadorned, yet they carried the weight of promises unspoken. Clara's tears came harder, but this time they were not born of despair. She pressed her hand to her mouth, nodding as though those words had been the lifeline she hadn't known she needed. For the first time since she had been left at the altar, she felt the smallest seed of hope take root. Jacob passed Mary back to her, his hands lingering for just a moment before he stood. He didn't say more, didn't need to. His silence, once so heavy, now felt like something else, like the steady ground beneath her feet, the unspoken assurance that he would not leave her as others had. And in that quiet house on the edge of the prairie, something began to grow between them. Not the fiery love of storybooks, not the kind that bloomed with grand gestures and whispered poetry. But something slower, steadier, built on presence, on resilience, on the shared weight of lives once broken. Something truer than either of them had known before.